The quiet streets of the nighttime city absorbed the light of the street lamps, and only the echoing footsteps of the police patrol broke the peaceful silence. It wasn't the first time James Smith had patrolled this neighborhood, but tonight was different. Every movement in the darkness seemed somehow alien, as if an invisible threat hung in the air. He drove through the empty streets and turned down one of the dark alleys when his gaze suddenly locked on a figure on the sidewalk. Young kid, black, about 16 or 17. He walked with a surprisingly nervous look, occasionally glancing around as if he were waiting for someone or sensing something. James couldn't figure out what it was about him that caught his eye, but his instinct said one thing. Something was wrong. The guy was oddly clumsy, his movements not matching what a teenager his age should have. He kept changing pace, as if he didn't know where to go, as if he were being chased, even though there wasn't a soul around. The policeman slowed down and pulled the car closer, stopping it at the edge of the road. The headlights illuminated the boy's figure. He looked wary, as if he felt he was being watched, but he couldn't make out who it was. His eyes, large and full of fear, darted about the streets, and his body twitched involuntarily at every rustle. James wiped the sweat from his forehead, even though the weather was cool. This was not normal. "Hey, kid," he shouted as he got out of the car, not hiding his concern. The boy froze, but didn't immediately turn around. James saw his shoulders tense and his body tense, as if he were preparing to run away. Panic flashed in Andrew's eyes, which alerted the policeman. He noticed at once that he didn't know whether to stay or run away. "Is something wrong?" James continued, trying to be calm, but inwardly feeling the tension building. The guy didn't answer, but his feet were moving as if he was thinking about hiding but didn't know where. "Hey, I said," James repeated, taking a step forward, moving closer. The young man turned around sharply, his eyes glaring sneakily at the policeman, and in that moment James felt his heart skip a beat. It wasn't just anxiety or fear, it was something more. The guy was clearly out of breath, his face contorted with tension, but there was no threat in his gaze. It was panic. "Are you okay?" James asked, but immediately realized that he had already gotten himself into that corner from which there was no return. The guy's clumsy movements were no accident. His gait, too abrupt, too nervous. James had seen many who were drugged, but this was something different now, something else he couldn't understand. "Are you kidding me?" the boy whispered, barely audible, and immediately James's gaze fell on his hands, which clenched into fists. He was ready for action, and something about it was unnatural. This was clearly more than just an inappropriate reaction from a teenager. James quickly assessed the situation. A thought flashed through his mind. Keep him under control. This all seemed suspicious, and he stepped closer. At that moment, the guy made an unnaturally sharp turn and tried to accelerate, but his movements were too strange. "Stop!" James shouted, taking a step forward, his hand almost touching his gun belt. Andrew froze. There was something in his eyes that made James stop. This was no ordinary teenager, not someone he was used to seeing on the streets. His gaze, his demeanor, they were as if there was some mystery behind him that he couldn't solve. But, as always, James was confident in his right to act. With each step, his heart beat faster and faster, and his anxiety grew. He didn't know why, but the feeling was so strong that he began to doubt his own decision. James froze, but not for long. His eyes crossed with the boy's, and in that instant the policeman felt a growing unease wash over him. He didn't know why, but something about this teenager was unsettling. It wasn't just nervousness, it was something more, something James couldn't explain. A thought ran through his head that he didn't want to admit to himself, but it wouldn't leave him. This guy isn't just nervous, he's hiding something. Ignoring the inner voice, James took a step forward, strengthening his posture, suddenly feeling much more in control. He had control in his hands. He was a police officer, and it was his right to check what was going on. His gaze became hard and stern, and his voice was filled with cold confidence when he spoke. "You're hiding something, kid. Don't try to lie. I know when someone is hiding something," he said, turning a full stream of suspicion on the teen. Andrew didn't even seem to know how to react. His body continued to twitch nervously, and he tried desperately to maintain a semblance of calm. But James noticed the way his hands clenched into fists, as if the guy was already prepared to resist. It only served to reinforce the policeman's preconceived notions. "Okay, let's not play games. Are you going to tell me what's in your pockets?" James took the next step forward, his tone becoming more and more aggressive. He no longer regarded it as mere suspicion. To him, it was already business. The guy, black and nervous, was clearly guilty, and James was sure his intuition wouldn't fail him. This wasn't the first time he'd encountered the likes of this teenager, and in his opinion, he knew how to proceed. Andrew, nervously eyeing the cop's every move, opened his mouth to say something, but James interrupted him. "Don't waste your time. I'm not going to listen to your excuses, kid. You're obviously hiding something." James pushes him hard against the wall, running his hands through his pockets. "Hey, don't touch me!" Andrew snapped, trying to pull away, but he couldn't. James's hand gripped his shoulder tightly, pressing him against the cold brick wall. "Too much talking, too many excuses. I said, don't hide anything," James insists, sure that if the guy isn't hiding anything, he won't be so nervous. Andrew tries to push off again, but his movements only become more clumsy, as if his body is obeying something invisible. His breathing quickens and his voice grows quieter, almost pleading. But James doesn't want to hear any of it. "What? You think you're special because you're black? That you're allowed to do anything?" bursts out of the policeman, and his words are filled not only with anger, but with clear racist overtones. He no longer saw this teenager as a human being. He was just another suspect, another criminal in his world. Andrew, with each word, seemed to lose the rest of his strength. He realized that the conversation with this policeman might be his last if he didn't do something about it. But it was as if his legs wouldn't listen and his hands couldn't resist. The cop knew he shouldn't have used violence, but he was sure that in this case, it was his only way to get the teenager to open up. "You think you're hiding something, and I know you are," James continued, an icy confidence in his voice. But the cop's inner voice was beginning to ask, "What if you're wrong? What if this guy is just scared?" But no matter how hard he tried to hide his doubts, one single thought reigned in his mind. This teenager was guilty, and James, even though he knew he'd overstepped his bounds, didn't want to let go of his certainty. One single fact kept reverberating in his head. A black boy, nervous and reserved, could only be a criminal. "Oh, you want to play these games? Okay, let's see what you've got inside you," James hissed, and with that phrase the world around them seemed to shrink, leaving only a shadow, relentless and cruel. Andrew, realizing he couldn't get out, gritted his teeth in silence. He didn't know how to explain to the policeman that his nervousness was not a crime, but just his life. But he understood. He shouldn't give vent to his emotions. There was only helplessness in his eyes, hidden behind a blank stare, and it looked like an admission of guilt, though, in fact, it was something else entirely. Before we continue, let's stop for a short pause. Write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from, whether you've had situations in your life similar to what we describe, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new exciting stories. Your thoughts and opinions are important to us. And now we continue. James stood in front of Andrew, and his confidence in his own righteousness became impenetrable. He was convinced that this guy was hiding something important. Too nervous, too clumsy. His gaze was focused on one goal only: to solve the crime he could almost already see in those eyes. In his eyes, in his movements, James saw only one thing: the crime. "You're hiding something. I can see that right away," the policeman said with obvious contempt. His hand was clutching the handcuffs, and he almost didn't notice as his fingers began to tremble with nervous excitement. James was sure this guy was hiding something that confirmed his suspicions. Andrew stood still unmoving, with only confusion and fear in his eyes. His nervous gestures were the result of his inability to react properly to what was happening. He had a problem that the policeman had no idea about. A latent neurological disorder that was affecting his coordination was preventing him from behaving as James expected. But to the latter, this was only further proof of his guilt. "How are you behaving?" James shouted again, stepping closer and standing up close. "Look at him. You can see everything. You're just a coward, hiding something." "I know what you did," shouted the policeman, not giving Andrew the slightest chance to justify himself. He was furious, and in his eyes blazed a thirst for justice that was not known for compromise. Andrew didn't know what to do. He tried to pull himself together, but his body wouldn't listen. His fists clenched in his hands, but every gesture was somehow mechanical, strange. He tried to just calm down, to try to think, but the fear was too strong, both the fear and the powerlessness. "What are you hiding, huh?" James was no longer holding himself back. His voice was full of hatred, a threat that could destroy everything. He tried to grab Andrew's shoulder again, but the teenager jerked and recoiled, which only added to the cop's frustration. "You'd better come clean before it's too late if you want to avoid more trouble," James continued to yell, closing in and forcing Andrew to back away. Andrew felt his legs growing weak and he could barely stay on his feet. He knew that any movement he made would be interpreted as aggression. He knew that the cop didn't see him as just a teenager. He only saw him as a criminal, a black criminal. "Yes, that you don't? Don't you get it?" James's voice sounded like a riddled pistol shot, filled with anger and contempt. He was pointing his finger directly at Andrew's chest, making him feel so helpless, so unnecessary. The policeman didn't see it. He couldn't understand what was happening to this teenager. His eyes saw only what he wanted to see. Andrew couldn't help himself. He wanted to say something to justify himself. He wanted to scream that he had nothing behind his back, that he wasn't a criminal, that his behavior was just his problem. But in his head, the thoughts couldn't gather. His body wouldn't obey. "What are you afraid of, huh? I'm telling you, you look like a criminal who knows he's not getting off the hook," James said, grabbing Andrew's wrist and squeezing his hand so hard that the boy couldn't hold back a quiet shriek of pain. James couldn't understand how his own words were piercing through everything around him. Andrew could feel his breath catching, and his breathing was getting heavier and heavier. The policeman didn't see the boy's nervousness growing into helplessness and despair. He saw only what he himself wanted to see. Not a disorder, not a disease, not coordination problems. None of that mattered to James. All that mattered was something he made up himself. The black guy was a criminal, and nothing else mattered. "Stop it. Please. I didn't do anything." Andrew breathed out with difficulty, but James didn't hear. He didn't want to hear. His mind was blocked, and all he had in front of his eyes was this teenager, the menace lurking in his eyes. James couldn't even imagine that Andrew was just a scared kid who probably felt vulnerable because he was black in this world full of injustice and racism. "Do you really expect me to believe you?" James hissed, clutching the handcuffs in his hands. "You know I'm going to catch you, don't you? You just want me to let you go." "But it won't be that easy, kid." Andrew stood before him, fists clenched, eyes full of fear and despair. He knew that if he didn't say what they wanted him to say, the situation could get out of hand. But he also knew that words wouldn't save him from the cop who had already decided that this teenager was a criminal. Every word he said sounded like a scream from the depths. Andrew felt fear clutching his throat and his heart pounding in his chest. His words rushed out, but they couldn't break through the wall James had erected around him. He tried to say something important, trying to convince the policeman that everything that was going on was a misunderstanding. But all his efforts only made things worse. "Look, I'm not a criminal." Andrew's voice shook with fear. He took a step back, trying to keep his distance, but his body wouldn't listen, and every gesture he made only confirmed that he looked like a criminal. He was a prisoner of his own fear and misunderstanding. James couldn't and wouldn't listen. "Are you going to lie to my face?" James grabbed him by the shoulder with fury, holding him tightly as if leaving him no way out. The policeman barely noticed as his actions became more and more aggressive. His face was covered in red fury. There was a coldness in his eyes that left no room for understanding or compassion. "You can't even stand properly and you're trying to explain something to me? You don't know how to act like you always do, and then you want me to take your word for it." James's voice was getting louder and more threatening. He couldn't hear what Andrew was trying to say. He didn't see him as a human being. In his eyes, this teenager was just another criminal hiding his face behind lies and excuses. "I'm not going to lie. I'm just scared." Andrew tried desperately to explain, but the fear still wouldn't let go. He tried to find the strength to speak, to tell the policeman about his problem. But every step he took only served to heighten James's suspicions. Every look he made, every attempt to explain himself, looked more and more like a guilty man trying to get away. "Scary, huh? You just said you were scared. You know what? I know who's really scared. It's you, because you know you're going to get caught." James smiled sinisterly, and his hand gripped Andrew's shoulder even tighter. "You're scared because you know you'll get caught by the hand. You're hiding something, and I'm sure you're guilty." Andrew wanted to scream that he wasn't. He wanted to scream that he had nothing to do with the crimes, that he just couldn't act normal because of his condition. But every step he took toward the truth seemed to James to be proof of his guilt. For the policeman, this whole situation was already solved. All he saw was a criminal, and everything else was just excuses. "You bloody think you can hide the truth so easily?" shouted James, griping Andrew's sleeves and sharply subtasking him to himself. "You don't know how to act normal. You've just always been like this. I've seen people like you, and that's not going to change." In those moments, when James grabbed his shoulder again, Andrew felt everything inside him break. His body felt foreign, his movements clumsy, and all he saw in the cop's eyes was contempt. He was nothing more than just another black guy who needed to be cleaned up. All of his words, resentment, fear, frustration, didn't matter. In James's eyes, they only confirmed his theory that the guy in front of him was a criminal, guilty by default. I have nothing to hide, Andrew could barely hold back the tears. He could feel himself being humiliated and insulted, but he couldn't find the strength to stop the flow. He wasn't prepared for what he was experiencing. His life was turning into a nightmare, and all these moments of humiliation were penetrating him like a knife. He was, involuntarily rising, desperate for some kind of chance, a chance for understanding, a chance for salvation. But James wouldn't let him speak. "Stop it, boy," I said. "I'm sick of you," James bellowed, his face red with rage. He shoved Andrew away sharply, making him almost fall to the ground. "You expect me to believe you? What, you want me to explain something to you again?" Andrew froze. He was in complete shock. His body was burned with humiliation, and his eyes still glittered with fear. There was nothing but confusion inside him. Every step, every movement he made only emphasized how vulnerable he was in this world where his black skin was already a sentence. His breathing became ragged, and an inner voice screamed for help. But James didn't hear it. With every word he said, every gesture the policeman threw, Andrew grew smaller, more helpless, more vulnerable. All he knew was that his life was full of fear and humiliation, and every time he felt it, it was like a rusty blade stabbing into his soul. The noise of the street traffic subsided just as James felt himself losing control. All he could see was the teenager, whose behavior irritated him beyond belief. Everything was suspicious. Every move he made, every attempt to back away. This wasn't just a guy, this was a threat. And James, not realizing that his actions were becoming increasingly violent, kept approaching, unwilling to give in. "I said freeze!" he shrieked, grabbing Andrew by the shoulder and shoving him violently against the wall. The policeman felt his muscles tense with rage and his breathing became harsh and intermittent. Andrew didn't react as quickly as he expected. His body, clumsy, slowed down, tried desperately to keep his balance, but his arms wouldn't budge. His entire nervous system was compromised, and it was becoming more and more obvious to James, but that only made the cop hate him more. He can't hold himself together. He's definitely hiding something. The policeman, unable to tolerate his resistance any longer, grabbed the guy by the neck, pinning him to the cold concrete. "What the hell are you doing here?" James yelled, clenching his hands together in a frenzy. Every time Andrew tried to push him away or move, it only added to the aggression in the cop's actions. "Do you think you're allowed to act like this? Are you trying to trick me?" Andrew was desperately trying to catch his breath, but every movement he made was becoming more and more faint. His neurological disorder, which affected his coordination, prevented him from reacting as quickly as James would have expected. Thoughts fought hostilely in his head, but his body couldn't comply. He wasn't able to pull away from the policeman, nor was he able to move normally. All he could feel was James's arms tightening around his neck and the walls shifting around him, creating the illusion that he was already absorbed into this world. "What the fuck are you doing?" James continued to squeeze him, his anger blossoming more and more. He felt entitled. In his eyes, the guy in front of him was just another suspect that needed to be brought to justice, and all because of his black skin. It wasn't just contempt, it was instinct that the young man was guilty, and James was ready to humiliate him to the end. "Please, don't do this." Andrew, barely suppressing tears, whispered, but his words went blank. His pleas couldn't overshadow the rage that blazed in James's eyes. "Are you kidding me, kid? Why are you so jumpy?" the policeman yelled, pushing Andrew to the ground. "You can't even be held normally. Your movements are like a criminal's. You can't even stand normally." His voice filled with mockery and humiliation. "Are you taking me for a fool?" Every word was like a blow. Andrew felt his dignity eroding, his strength draining away. He was nothing. James was stronger. He was the authority. He was right. And there was nothing in that could stop him. Andrew realized that his life, his battle with the cop, was ending here. He couldn't fight back, couldn't do anything. His body was squeezing, his head was spinning with fear and suffocation, and his thoughts were finally beginning to blur. It was all so real and painful that he couldn't understand how it could have happened that in one moment he was trapped in this place. His hands clenched into fists, but there was nothing they could do. Andrew didn't know how to fight this policeman. He knew he had no power to get out of this situation. He thought it was all just a nightmare, but no, this was reality. James continued to squeeze him, and Andrew couldn't even try to get free. The policeman looked at him with contempt, his eyes glowing with the fire of hatred. He did not think about what he was doing. He didn't realize he was just a frightened teenager who was incapable of fighting back. He saw only his dominance. He saw only Andrew as a target, as a criminal, and that was enough. "Do you even realize how much I'm sick of you?" James continued, his voice now sounding with renewed vigor. Andrew was completely in his hands, and nothing could change what was happening anymore. He was broken physically and mentally, and James seemed to realize it. He felt that he had won. "Now you know what it's like to be in control. Do you understand?" the policeman said, letting him go but leaving Andrew on the ground like a helpless creature. Andrew couldn't answer, and all he could do was lie on the cold ground, his body shaking with stress and humiliation. Something heavy hung in the air, like a premonition of the inevitable. Andrew lay on the cold ground, feeling his chest tighten and his breathing become more and more labored. He could no longer think. His entire body was filled with heavy pain, and every moment he spent under James's control seemed like an eternity. But even though the policeman let him go, he didn't give the teenager a second to recover. James stood over him, looking at him with an expression that made Andrew feel his inner dignity dissolve into thin air. All he knew was that his life was no longer what he knew it to be. He was humiliated beyond belief, and every look James threw at him only intensified that pain. "You think you're worth something, you black criminal?" James leaned toward him in anger, and his words pierced Andrew like a knife through his heart. There was such coldness in his eyes that the very air around them seemed to grow viscous and heavy. James couldn't stop himself. These words weren't just random insults. They were more than that. His voice, his looks, his attitude. It was all infused with the deepest racism, and Andrew couldn't understand how he could be the target of such hatred just because of his skin. "You, black man, have always been this way, always walking the path of the criminal. It's your essence, your nature. You can't be any different, do you understand?" James leaned even lower, his face almost close, and his every phrase was filled with such contempt that Andrew felt his soul being torn apart. His whole world shrunk to those words, and there was only one thing in his eyes: not to understand, not to forgive, not to believe. Andrew felt his dignity slipping away before his eyes. He couldn't hold back any longer. The tears he had long held back began to burst out, but it wasn't relief. It was an extension of the pain. He couldn't accept what he was going through. He couldn't believe that his body and soul were so vulnerable that he couldn't stop this torrent of violence, couldn't change anything. You've always been like this, no matter how much you try to hide behind your words. I realized what you are a long time ago, a black criminal like the rest of them, James continued, not giving him a chance to even just exhale. He was sure those words made him right. There was no doubt or apology for him. This teenager was guilty, and all attempts to explain his innocence were in vain. Andrew, lying on the ground, felt his inner world crumbling. He tried to get up, tried to justify himself in some way, but his voice was disappearing. All he could do was hear his racial identity become a source of pain, hatred, and contempt. Every movement he made, every attempt to speak, was only proof to James of his guilt. You will never be equal. You'll never get out of this circle because you're stuck in it yourself. You, black man, will always be a criminal in the eyes of the people. Do you understand? James continued, and every gesture he made was a blow to his dignity, to Andrew's life, to his belief that the world would someday be different. Andrew couldn't hold back his tears any longer. He could feel the fear turning into deep despair. His face was contorted with pain, his eyes full of tears and the impossibility of returning to the normal world. He tried to say something, but the words wouldn't come out. He could no longer think or act. His fear was turning into complete helplessness. He didn't know what to do with this flood of hatred that left him no chance. James, not realizing how far he'd gone, continued to taunt. He didn't realize how he was destroying everything around him, how every word he said added to the humiliation. He saw only what he wanted to see, a guilty man, a criminal who deserved it all. You are nothing. You're not human. You have no right to anything. You are nothing. Those words were the final blow that Andrew could no longer bear. There was so much pain, so much heaviness in their sound that they penetrated his soul and tore it apart. Andrew, feel as his inner world rush, oustil head. He realized that in James's eyes he would never be anything more than a black criminal again. He couldn't fight it anymore. Before we continue, let's stop for one more short pause. Write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from, whether you've had similar situations in your life and how you dealt with them. If you like to follow the development of the story, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new stories. And now we continue. James stood over Andrew, his breath still heavy with anger. He watched as the teenager, holding back tears, wiped the blood from his lips and tried to stand up, wobbling in pain. It was almost over, and James felt he had the upper hand again. The cop was sure he had already done his job. The guy had been punished, and now he could be taken to the station. All that was left was to make it official. You can't act like that, James said, still angry, but already calming down, ready to continue his actions. He glanced at Andrew, who seemed to be trying to recover. He was broken, but James decided that was enough. Come on, we're on our way, he added, turning toward the car. But then, just as the policeman was about to take a step, Andrew suddenly raised his head and spoke words that made James freeze. You don't know who my mother is. These words, spoken with an unusual calm determination, shackled the policeman's movements. He stopped, unable to move. He could not understand why these simple words had caused him such alarm. It wasn't just a strange statement. It was something more, something important that he couldn't realize right away. James felt his heart freeze for a moment, and something inside him rose a wave of tension. He turned back to Andrew, his gaze wary, but he still couldn't understand why the guy had said that. A thought immediately flashed through his mind. Is he hiding someone? Who is his mother? Why is this such a big deal? James didn't know who this woman was, but in his head he began to get the feeling that he had made some kind of mistake that he couldn't immediately realize. "What did you say?" James's voice became harsh. He tried to hide his excitement, but the tension that came from his words was obvious. Andrew, noticing the policeman's reaction, realized that his words had had an effect. He could feel the uncertainty growing inside him, how this sudden revelation might change the course of events. But, despite his fear, he continued, looking into James's eyes with a determination he hadn't seen before. "You don't know who my mother is?" Andrew repeated, his voice sounding firmer now. "She's a high-ranking official. She has connections. You don't understand who I really am." James stood there in indecision. He was trying to figure out what exactly had changed. The words were a shock to him. He tried to comprehend them, but his head couldn't grasp the whole point quickly enough. A high-ranking official? Who? The thought flashed through his mind that he might have encountered someone far more important than this teenager, but who exactly remained a mystery. He looked at Andrew, a new question in his eyes. What if this teenager wasn't who he thought he was? What if this was all a false image James had created in his head, trying to justify his cruelty? "I don't believe you," James said, but his voice didn't sound so confident anymore. Something about those words made him doubt. What if? What if this guy could really be who he said he was? But James wasn't ready to admit his mistake. He was too proud and too sure he was right to back down right away. "You're just apologizing because you want me to let you go. That's all." James leaned toward Andrew again, but now his confidence was beginning to melt. His gaze became wary as he examined the teenager again, trying to find any weakness in his eyes, any evidence that he was right. "I'm not trying to justify myself. I'm just telling the truth," Andrew replied without averting his gaze. "If you don't believe me, you'll find out soon enough. My mother knows where you work, who you are, and what you do. She won't let you let it go that easily." Andrew's words hung in the air like thunder. James stood there in utter confusion. He didn't know what to do next. There was only one thing on his mind. If it was true, if Andrew's mother was really an important figure, then his life, his career, perhaps all his actions could be in jeopardy. "Okay," James finally said, trying to regain his confidence, but his voice didn't have the hardness it had before. He wasn't confident anymore, and that worried him. "Let's see who you really are." Though he tried to look calm, something was beginning to churn inside him. What had just seemed obvious was suddenly covered in layers of doubt and bewilderment. James was no longer sure he was in control of the situation. When the police patrol pulled up in front of Andrew's house, James felt his heart start to beat faster. He didn't even notice when the car stopped. His mind was on what had just happened. Andrew's words wouldn't leave his mind. "You don't know who my mother is." He had, of course, thought it was just a ploy, an attempt to scare him. But now, as they drove up to this large house on the outskirts of town, doubts began to seep into his mind. James looked at Andrew, who was sitting silently in the car, his face still pale, but he was no longer struggling. He realized that this was the moment of truth. If indeed the guy had a mother who could be connected to power, it could only mean one thing. He might be in the middle of a problem far more serious than he had ever imagined. They got out of the car, and James looked up at Andrew's house. It was beautiful, modern day, with high windows, carefully gajenemy, and hedge, through which it was impossible to look away. Everything about this house spoke of wealth and influence. James tried to keep his cool, but his nerves were taut as a string. "Take him to the door," he commanded his colleagues, and 2 policemen stepped forward, dragging Andrew with them. He still didn't move quickly, as if each step was difficult. When they reached the door, someone from the house opened it. It was a middle-aged woman wearing an austere suit. Her eyes seemed to find Andrew at once, but then they shifted to the police officers, and her face changed immediately. An inner tension, as if something ancient and commanding was transmitted from her to everyone present. "What's going on?" Her voice was calm, but there was a confidence and strength in it that neither tone nor gestures could hide. James and his colleagues froze. They hadn't expected this. The woman was not just an ordinary citizen. There was something in her eyes, in her posture, that immediately gave James an uneasy feeling. It was the moment he realized his mistake. "Mom," Andrew finally managed to utter, his voice barely audible, and he turned his head, meeting the woman's gaze. At that moment, James felt his blood run cold. The woman he had just encountered was familiar to him. She was Maya Wright, the deputy mayor of the city, a person of immense influence in the political sphere, whose decisions often determine the future of entire neighborhoods. She was known for her determination, intelligence, and power. Her every word in the city weighed like 1,000 others, and no one dared to argue with her. Now, James realized that he had fallen into an unimaginable trap. "What does that mean?" Maya asked, her voice now filled with cold determination. "Why did you bring my son here?" James felt his throat constrict and didn't know what to say. He tried to speak, but the words stuck. Only one thought pulsed in his head. "I've made a terrible mistake." As a police officer, he was used to being in control situations, used to deciding who was right and who was wrong. But here, in front of Maya, he felt weak, almost helpless. "This is a misunderstanding, Mrs. Wright," one of James's colleagues tried to begin, but his words sounded muffled, like an echo. "We've detained your son on suspicion of an offense, but it will be cleared up now." Maya looked at the police officers like a predator assessing its prey. Her eyes, dark and penetrating, were full of surprising calm, but there was a fire in their depths that made James feel a cold sweat run down his spine. "Tell me," her voice became almost nonchalant, "what were you doing with my son? Why was he held for so long? Why was he humiliated?" James felt his pride begin to crumble. He knew that he could never explain what had happened, and that words could not justify his actions. He took a quick glance at Andrew, who stood with his eyes downcast, as if surreptitiously awaiting punishment, and suddenly realized that everything he had done was wrong. He tried to justify himself, but he didn't know how. Maya Wright wasn't just a mother. She was a woman who could ruin his career in a second if she wanted to. "It won't happen again, Mistress Wright," James tried to say, his voice now quiet and almost inaudible. He tried to retain some dignity, but realized it was slipping away. Maya stepped closer to Andrew, placing a hand on his shoulder, and her gaze shifted back to the police officers. "My son was never a criminal," she said quietly, but her words hung in the air, and every syllable of them sounded like a sentence. "You will be held accountable for what you've done. I'm not going to let this go without consequences." James felt his body tense up. Thoughts rushed through his head, but he couldn't utter a word. Everything that was happening was beyond anything he had ever expected. The woman in front of him wasn't just a mother. She was a force that could destroy everything he'd built. And James realized he was facing someone he didn't want to deal with. He realized he had become part of a game whose rules he never knew the rules of. The moment Maya turned toward the police officers, James felt his career, his life, and everything he knew begin to crumble. "Leave," she said, and her voice sounded as if her decision was final. "And don't come back here. If you don't want more trouble, it's best for everyone." James, unable to stay any longer, nodded and walked silently out, accompanied by his colleagues. But a feeling remained in his soul, as if he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Over the next few days, James felt his life change dramatically. Every morning, his confidence was shattered more and more, and what had seemed like a minor misunderstanding quickly turned into a nightmare. He went home that night, after his meeting with Maya Wright, trying to justify to himself what had happened, but he couldn't. Everything was swirling around in his head like a whirlpool. He tried to remember how he could have succumbed so quickly to prejudice, how he could have so easily turned that teenager's life into a nightmare. His chest clenched with guilt, but he couldn't admit it. He was a cop, and cops, he thought, were always right. But all his confidence in his own right crumbled with each new call, each new message. Early in the morning, James received his first call. It was a coworker, and his voice sounded strange, almost nervous. "James, have you seen the news?" the man asked. "What's the news?" Without realizing, James replied, feeling his heart begin to beat faster. "Don't leave the house. Your picture and name are already on all the TV stations. They're talking about it everywhere." When James turned on the television, his own picture immediately appeared in front of him, and tickers began to appear at the bottom of the screen, informing him that the police were investigating the incident involving the arrest of Andrew Wright, the son of the deputy mayor. The story was moving so fast that he didn't even have time to realize what had happened. He didn't know how it happened, but his name was linked to accusations of abuse, racism, and abuse of power. These accusations were thrown in his face like stones, and every word on the screen hit him over the head. Police officer used excessive force in arresting teenager. Andrew Wright claims he was severely beaten. His race caused the violence. These phrases swirled around in his head like fiery sparks. James stood up, feeling his hands begin to shake. He knew that all of this was for a reason. Andrew, who had just suffered humiliation, was now obviously determined to tell his side of the story. But worse, his mother, Maya Wright, with her unlimited influence and powerful connections, had decided to make this case her life's work. That same night, James was called in for questioning. In the study, where he sidelined, surrounded by other police officers and high-profile attorneys, was showered and heavy. He could feel his face getting covered in sweat, but he couldn't hold back a nervous look. His reputation was in jeopardy, and he couldn't believe he was in this situation. "How can you explain your actions with this teenager?" one of the lawyers asked. James wiped his forehead. He knew his answers would be recorded, and anything he said could be used against him. "He was acting suspiciously. I couldn't just stand by and watch," James began, but his voice sounded muffled and detached. He realized that his excuses wouldn't be able to stop the storm. "But you do realize that the entire city now knows that you used force against the deputy mayor's son?" The lawyer continued, giving James no time to think. "He fought back. He tried to run away." James tried to justify himself, but every time he opened his mouth, he felt his words sound more and more strained. "Just be honest," the other lawyer said, looking at him reproachfully. We all realize you're a police officer, and your job isn't always an easy one. But to use force on a teenager just because he looks suspicious is too much." James felt his shoulders slump. He knew his actions, his aggression, were wrong, but now it was too late. The next day, all the newspapers in the city were full of headlines about his behavior. Everywhere there were articles detailing how the policeman used force in the arrest, how his behavior was racist and cruel. The reports showed snippets from surveillance cameras showing James forcefully holding Andrew, threatening him and using brute force. Photos of the teenager with bruises and handcuff marks flew around social media, followed by questions. How could this have happened? And why didn't the police check their actions? Now, James found himself at the center of a heated public debate. His whole life seemed to collapse in an instant. His own colleagues began to distance themselves from him, and anonymous complaints began to pour in at work. Some of them argued that he should be punished. Others said he was a victim of the system, and too quickly became accused of something that could not be justified. But even though James tried to justify himself to his colleagues, support was minimal. He realized that his actions had not only ruined his career, but also undermined his trust in the system he had once considered his life. All he knew was that his name was now synonymous with brutality, and there was no turning back. Maya Wright, using all her power, did not leave James alone. She made sure that the whole story was publicized at the state level. Every day the pressure on him increased, and those who had previously supported him began to look for ways to distance themselves. That night, sitting in his apartment watching TV, James realized that he could never go back to his old life. Everything was ringing in his head like an empty room, and only one question kept repeating itself over and over again. How could I have made such a mistake? His career was ruined, people's trust was gone, and now he was facing consequences he couldn't control. But worse, James knew that this incident was only the beginning. He could lose everything: his job, his respect, even his freedom. James sat in his small apartment, fists clenched, staring at the television as it showed his face again, a face that had once been a symbol of order and trust, now synonymous with cruelty and contempt. He felt the world crumbling around him, and his career, his life, everything he knew, was slipping away like sand through his fingers. Loud news credits told of lawsuits, investigations, and demands for dismissal. The words racism, brutality, abuse of power were everywhere. James was in the middle of it all, and now he felt like he was losing his very essence. Maya Wright, with her connections and influence, was one of the most powerful engines that spun the storm. After the Andrew story had hit town, she didn't just use her powers to increase pressure on the authorities, she took full control of the situation. Her legal team began working tirelessly, gathering evidence, witnesses, and even phone records that showed just how inappropriate James's behavior had been. He wasn't just a police officer who had made a mistake. He became a symbol of an entire system that didn't see or hear those who were vulnerable. With each passing day, public opinion grew more and more against James. His past, his years on the police force, his service to the law, began to lose all meaning in the light of what he had done. Even those who had once worked side by side with him began to reject him. They could not, would not justify what had happened. There had been statements, there had been complaints from residents who remembered how James had behaved on duty, but now it was all being re-examined through the prism of the mistake that had changed everything. While James was still trying to justify his actions, his lawyer was beginning to realize that the case was doomed. With so much pressure from both sides, the authorities and the public, it was hard for James to expect any justice. It was getting to the point where he would have to face the real consequences of his behavior. Maya Wright, meanwhile, continued to strengthen her position. After her son became the target of the whole affair, she decided she wasn't going to let it go. With every move she made, James could feel his chances of vindication melting away. Andrew, standing next to his mother, told his story, escalating it. He talked about how he had relived that day, how he had been humiliated, how he was on the edge of his psycho-emotional edge. Not only did he talk about how the police officer tried to disarm him, he talked about how his race was the most important reason why he was treated that way. All these stories led to mass protests, to rallies that swept the city. People demanded not only the dismissal of James, but also reforms in the police, a review of the entire system of interaction between police officers and citizens, especially those who were vulnerable. Under pressure from the public and the forces behind Maya, the trial gained new momentum. No longer was it simply a matter of disciplinary punishment for James. His actions began to be seen as part of a larger problem in the police system, and he could no longer escape responsibility. At the trial, James sat alone, watching his own name become a symbol of what was wrong in a society where people like him could think they could act with impunity. He heard his actions, his words, his deeds become part of an investigation that seemed to have no end. He tried to justify himself, but the more he spoke, the more absurd his attempt seemed. The judge, whose eyes were constantly watching him, had long since disbelieved his words. "You have not only violated the law, you have violated the trust that has been placed in you. You, a police officer who is supposed to protect people, have no right to use force to suppress those who are not at fault," the judge said, and her words cut through the space, leaving James utterly confused. Maya Wright didn't give him a chance. She had insisted that her whole story be heard in court, and her voice was the final blow to James's side. He could feel her, with every word she said, bringing him closer to collapse, to the lowest point of his life. "I lost trust in the system. I lost faith in the people who were supposed to protect my son," she said in court, her voice resolute and her eyes full of determination. When the judge gave his verdict, James was shocked. He was not just being punished. The court recognized his actions as not just a violation of the law, but an act that fell under the racial discrimination and mistreatment of citizens clause. His career as a police officer was over. He was fired and banned from future law enforcement work. As he took his judgment, James felt the world around him disintegrate. He didn't know how to handle it. Everything he knew was shattered. He lost his job. He lost the respect of his colleagues. He lost everything he thought was important in his life. Andrew and Maya Wright returned home, and their lives continued. The mother supported her son, and the case was a moment of truth for them. They received not only justice, but also a deeper understanding of the importance of fighting for their right to safety and respect. And James, sitting in the empty apartment, pondered how it had all happened. How one act, one moment of wrong decision had changed his life. What was he going to do now? He realized there would be no easy way back. What do you think about this story? Have you ever experienced racism or injustice in your life? Your thoughts and experiences are very important to us, and we value each and every one of you. Please leave a comment and share your opinions and experiences. If you like what we do, don't forget to give us a like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new stories. We are always happy to see your support. Write a topic phrase to let us know you listened to the end. We wish you a good day.